Have you ever been a part of a church that you had to leave? Maybe you loved the church, but just disagreed with the direction they were heading and felt like you could no longer be a part of it. What do you do when that happens? It's what we're talking about right now. Hi, I'm Jennifer Shookman, host of Right Now. Do you ever have one of those friends you felt like you've known for a lifetime, even though you just met them? That's the way today's guest feels. Carla Droege is a television and film actress with some of her favorite appearances being, now watch, you may watch these shows or someone you know, Big Fish, Pretty Little Liars, and Scorpion. I love Scorpion. She functions best, not when she's working, not when she's home, but when she's caffeinated. And she believes God made caffeine on the 8th day. And I'm pretty sure that Red Bull was the 9th day. So we all do what we have to do, right?
That's right. That's what we got to
do. You've worked on some really great things. Like, I love Scorpion. I remember the very first opening, they had this big jet engine. It was like, how did they do that for a television show and the whole thing? So tell us about, if you don't mind, if you can. I know there are secrets in Hollywood. Can you tell us behind the scenes stories of some of the people or the things you've worked on that we might find interesting?
Oh, absolutely. Well, Scorpion, also one of my favorites. And I think that's probably one of the first shows that I had to be like not a fan, try to not be a fangirl. I walk down and I see all these people that I know and I'm like, oh my God, but the nicest people. And I just love that because you hear stories in Hollywood, some people, oh, not so nice or really nice. And so it's so great when you get to go in and they're just wonderful. Oh. And the whole cast to a person, like sat and ate lunch with us. And so that's just made it, a really, really great experience, which was good fun. But I guess one of my all-time favorites, because it was my first one so long ago, was Big Fish. And it was really my first big job as an actor. And I got there and I literally eyes this big, like a kid in a candy store. And they didn't, the first day I was there for a costume fitting and they didn't tell me where they were taking me. They just came and can you come with us? And so I'm like, okay, whatever, I don't know. And they pick me up and they drive me to set. And so, and if you've seen the movie, I know it's been a while, but it's the little downtown where it's all grass and everybody runs around barefoot. And they bring me up and they tap somebody on the shoulder and turns around and it's Tim Burton. And they didn't tell me they were taking me to meet him. And so I'm just like, I don't remember the conversation. All I remember is in my head, be cool, be cool, be cool. Be cool. Just crazy. And then literally they turn to their right, they tap Ewan McGregor turns. So like this whole thing happens, but it was really fun.
Everybody's first day of work is like that.
Yeah, just like, and that actually doesn't usually happen. So it was a great first experience because it was also another fun set and really nice people. So it was fun. So yeah, it's just, there's a lot of crazy in Hollywood too, and in the terms of like it's not as glamorous as maybe people think. Usually if it's a summer day, it's actually 20 below outside and you're having to like pretend. So there's a lot of that, and you're in a weird, situation. You're like, not glamorous, but I love it. I love it so much.
How did you get to this point? Let's hear a little bit about how you grew up and your background.
I was acting since I was in grade school. I started early and just gravitated towards it, and then by high school I knew I wanted to follow it. I wanted to major, and so I did that in college. And then actually in college I kind of freaked out a little bit about how hard it is, and so I ended up going into stage managing because I also very organizational. So I did that for a number of years until the bug bit me again. And I was actually in Atlanta, and I started my career there for a number of years, and then just one day I was like, well,
time to move.
I'm gonna go see. And but yeah, so I've loved it all my life.
Were your parents supportive? What were your parents like?
Very supportive. My dad was a ordained minister, but mostly was a professor of theology at Valparaiso University in Indiana, and my mom was a nursing professor. And it was really great growing up with them because of the education and the Christian mix. Dinner table was what is the latest topic, and so at dinner, it was nothing was off base. You could throw it out, and it was, so I just never realized that talking about really hard subjects was difficult.
Because you talked about politics and
Because we
religion at the
did,
table.
politics, religion, you know, what's happening at school and what you're struggling with, and everybody was allowed to have an opinion, and then, so it was just always an exchange of ideas, which was really great. And so when I then went out into the world and found that people would get really upset when you would bring up touchy topics, I was like, I don't understand. We're just, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. You're trying to understand where I'm coming from. That's what we're doing, right?
We communicate to do that.
Yeah. And so that was a real kind of, you know, it was like I wasn't ready for that.
Yeah.
And I still find that frustrating because I still think it's so beneficial to be able to understand where somebody else is coming from. You don't have to agree with them.
Right.
But if you understand it, you can both grow.
Right.
And that's
I actually get in trouble a lot for asking too many questions sometimes. And it's because I just want to know, but it sometimes it feels like, I guess, like an accusation to people when I'm just trying to
learn.
Yeah, exactly. So you came to Hollywood and because you'd had such great experiences in churches and you know, felt like that was a, you know, source of comfort from your past. Did you look for a church when you got here?
Immediately. And actually, when I moved out here, even though I was excited about moving and pursuing my acting, I honestly thought moving to LA was going to be the worst thing ever. Like, I just thought it was going to be miserable. So my main thing was I got to get plugged in. I got to, you know, find something that's going to help me in the hard times. So I looked for a church right away. And I visited a number of places, but then I finally happened upon this one, and just the first day was like, oh, yes, like this is it. And it was a relatively new church. They'd only been in existence for a couple of years and growing, and so it just had this really wonderful community. And and I started going there, and I take this back. I started going and like picked it and kept going. I didn't get involved right away, but then after about 6 months, they were looking for volunteers for something, and I think I kind of felt like, all right, I probably should, you know, like, 'cause I'm coming here. And that was the best thing because I volunteered and then I started meeting people and that's how it all started, and I got really plugged in, and that's how it started becoming real community. Yeah,
and I think there's something that happens, especially in a new or a growing church, when you're involved with it, you feel such a part of things. You feel a sense of ownership about what's happening, and it's an exciting way to not only be in community and meet new people, but also feel like you're doing something that's taking something forward. So I can imagine how, you know, good that feels. So did you just volunteer? Did you get more involved then, or how did that?
I was volunteering, and then I was actually asked to join the deacons, which I was like, well, okay, you know. But what was funny is because it was a new church, they had the deacon group, but the deacons didn't really know what their function was per se. So that first year, a group of us worked together to come up with a charter.
Oh, nice.
And, you know, okay, so this is what this group is going to be about. And then the funny story for me.
It's almost like stage managing. You're organizing people. Only now you're doing people in a charter. Here's what our roles are. Here's what we do.
This is how this is going to work.
And bringing some structure to the church.
Exactly.
Which is great in a growing church.
And it is. And I discovered how much I really liked that. And then it was funny because the woman who was the chair that year was pregnant and was going to step down. So they were restructuring the way that they were going to have it work. So there was going to be a deacon council with a deacon chair. And I knew because I had helped write the charter that maybe they would ask me to be a part of the council. I was like, oh, that'd be fun. I don't want to be the chair though. No, you know, like maybe I should say something. No, I would turn it down if it happened. Well, unbeknownst to me, the current chair had recommended me as chair, and then the leadership had approved me as chair.
Without you knowing?
Without me knowing about any of this at this point, right?
The position you're going to turn down?
Yeah. So when this all happened, she came to me and she's like, all right, you can say no, but I feel like it's time you actually got brought into this conversation. This is what happened. It's yours if you want it. And I was like, well, I kind of think it's no, but I'll pray about it, you know, because
You're
it happened like this.
Girl, right?
Well, and it came to me this way. So I said, but it's probably no. The next day I sat down and I started praying about it, and I knew immediately I was supposed to do it. I was like, really? But long story short, I did it, and it was probably one of the coolest experiences I've ever had. It was, I discovered a skill set I didn't know I had, and it also just sort of put me out on the edge of faith where you have to count on God showing up, and He did. And it was just a really exciting time, and it was really fun to be a part of that.
That's amazing to go from just like, I'm going to find a place where I can find community, to creating it for others is essentially what you're doing when you're in a leadership role like that. So that sounds like a great story, and if it ended there, it would be a great story. But something happened along this journey, and Carla's going to tell us about that when it comes back, and it'll be an even greater story because of what she went through and what you can learn from her for what you may be going through. Stay tuned after this break. Welcome back. We're talking with Carla Droege, who moved out to Hollywood, got involved in a career that she was really excited to be a part of, and even better, found a place where she could feel community and belong, and then rose up through levels of leadership so that she was able to create that kind of community for other people. This is an amazing thing. You found skills that you didn't know you had. You're helping a church that needed some structure to find some structure. You're now the chairman of the Deacons. And what happens next?
Well, after a couple of years with that, I actually then stepped up into a different level of leadership on the board. And so kind of just continued on the way, and still just really enjoying the experience and loving it, and learning a lot too, which is really great. And then as a church, as we were growing, one of the things that the leadership decided that would be helpful for the congregation was to maybe address some of the hot button issues that all churches and the world faces.
Sure.
And just really say, this is where we as a church stand, so that people are coming can know that and make their decisions, like, is this a church I feel like I'm comfortable with or not? And so I thought it was a great idea.
Yeah. And then everybody on staff can point to that and say, here's what it is, there's no miscommunication.
Right.
Yeah.
And then as a leadership, we can support and all be on the same page.
Sure.
So I think it was a really smart move. But one of the things I asked during that process is, if we're looking at these hot button issues, do we as leadership, are we saying that we completely 100% agree with this, or are we saying that we will affirm and support them as leaders? And initially in the conversations, it was affirm. And I was like, great, I can sign off on that. I will absolutely support this as a leader of the church. Later on, as things progressed and other people had questions about it, the document came back up to the board and they discussed it again. And the conversation went a little differently then, more towards everybody has to 100% agree with this.
Tell me what the difference is in your mind between those two things.
Well, I'll use an example of women in leadership. I know people have very different opinions at different churches, and I totally respect that. Our particular church, before I was in leadership, decided that women were accepted in leadership. Obviously, I had become one.
Right.
But they had gone through a long process of that decision, and that was how they came out. I had really good friends who were men who disagreed with that. They didn't think women should be in leadership, but they were very supportive of me as a leader. And that to me is affirm.
Okay.
Like, you don't have to say that you might have a different opinion, but if you're going to be a leader, you're going to support where the church
But as long
stands.
as I'm in this church and I see Carla, who I believe is a good leader, I'll affirm that.
I will affirm that, yes. And so that's kind of how I look at it. And I think that makes sense, because those men I thought were great leaders. I'd hate for them to be kicked out of leadership because they didn't agree with that particular, let's bring everybody's best.
And it's rare that everybody agrees on everything anyway. I mean, it just doesn't
never
happen.
going to happen. There's always going to be, for me anyway, I look for a church where it is as close as possible, but one of the things that's beautiful about us as humans is we're different, so.
Yeah. Well, and affirming and accepting gives room for me to say, like, I have a different opinion.
Right.
I do.
Yes.
And we're all okay with that.
Exactly.
Which seems like a really healthy and mature thing to be able to do.
And that's kind of where I was coming from. But as with anything, and I think especially in church, this particular document was about hot button issues. And so people got, I would say people got fearful, but I don't, people
they got hot.
Yeah, they got hot. The issues got hot. That's a good way to put it. And so people feel very strongly about those issues, and I get that. And so it became a conversation about whether these were going to be, whether you have to 100% accept them. And I disagreed with that. And for me, it became about, there are religious scholars on both sides of some of these issues. Very learned, schooled people who are on both sides of them.
Who have healthy differences, both believe in traditional kinds of things, but have looked at scripture or something and taken it in different ways, or feel like it is represented differently in the culture we live in.
Exactly. And so I felt like, yes, the church should have a position, and I will support the position, but I feel like it's a dangerous thing to say that we have the corner of the market on truth. Like that we absolutely know
this issue is left and
yes,
this issue is right. Or
exactly. You know, because if you look through history, you think how many times there have been things where there was, you know, this is the way it is, and then there was learning.
Yeah.
So I just
Slavery
felt like
in the church being a really good one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know,
they used to be preached in the South. You said you were in Atlanta.
Yes.
That this was the right thing and it was biblical. Yeah.
And so that there should be room for people to say, I just feel like we need to talk about that more.
Yeah.
And the way the conversation went was there was no room to talk about it anymore.
Oh wow.
And unfortunately, because of that, it wasn't even so much that I chose to step down. I was asked to.
Oh,
I was
wow.
asked to take my dissenting voice out of the room, and that was where it was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it was sort of, you know, for me on two fronts, because I had moved out to LA and I don't have any family here. This church had become my family, and so I felt like, you know, I had been totally, and without a conversation, I think that was the hardest thing for me is that nobody really came and talked to me about, I think they were worried that I had different views about these hot button issues, but nobody ever asked me. So I just don't know, you know.
So you didn't know if it was, see if I can interpret for you.
Yeah.
It seems like you were saying, my issue is whether it's 100% agreement, we
Yes.
all feel the same way, versus I'll accept and support that the church feels this way and you know, manage my answers and things along the church party lines as I'm, you know, a representative of the church. And that's what you were arguing about. But
Yes.
they may have seen issue 1 and thought you were left and they were right, or issue 2
Right.
and you were right and they were left. And so they're basically saying you need to leave. And you're saying, like, I didn't even take a position on those things.
I'm not saying I disagree with you. Yeah, exactly.
I'm just saying we should have room for people to be able
yes,
to.
and that is exactly what happened. Is I was arguing for, let's not say that this is totally the way it is for all time. And I think that there was an interpretation that maybe I was disagreeing, and that was not the case. Regardless,
You didn't get a chance to
I didn't get a
express that.
chance to express it. Nobody asked me, and so it was heartbreaking. And I am not generally a very emotional person, but you know, it was like a lot of crying.
Yeah, it's like being exiled from your family.
It's exactly what it was. And LA's a hard city, and I felt totally alone. It was the first time I really understand what it was to feel heartbroken. Now I was very lucky in the sense that I got a lot of closure, because these were after the fact and after some additional conversations. Most of the people involved, I ended up having one-on-one conversations with, and to a person, they said that they had all handled it badly. So I know a lot of people don't get that, and I was really lucky to have had some really loving people try and circle back, which is, I think, how we should
Right.
go. And I think the really important thing too is there was forgiveness all around, and I am grateful for that, and I think as Christians we are called to that. But I still couldn't go back to the church.
Yeah, it does sound that people were mature and maybe realized we had misunderstood or miscommunicated the situation and tried to come back. And you can accept that, and you handled this lovingly and graciously. And I know there's a little bit more to the story. You wrote letters at appropriate times and very carefully tried to explain your position to the people who could respond and didn't maybe get the attention or understanding that you had hoped you would. So and so eventually you're asked to leave, and you can't feel like you can even come back to church on Sunday because you've been in this position, and people still come up and ask you questions, and now what do you do? Go like, you can't, you got to ask him, or I mean, that's just an awkward thing.
Yeah.
So what does it feel like that first Sunday morning when you don't set the alarm clock to go to the church that you looked forward to and been such an active part of for so long?
Tears. I grew up in the church. I had always gone to church, and then I'd found this really wonderful home, and I like lonely and alone. It was the thing that kept going through my head, and and almost like, what do I do with myself?
Yeah.
Like I don't know how to move forward from this. And I was angry with God. I wasn't so much angry with the people, because I know people are fallible. We all are. We all make mistakes. But at that point, I became really angry with God, because I felt like he had been leading me so clearly on this path of leadership, and pulled the rug out.
Yeah, you hadn't stepped out in front of him.
Right.
So, yeah.
I was like, it made him feel very mercurial, and I was very angry, and it triggered me into what I now understand as a dark night of the soul. I didn't know it at the time. I just knew that it was desert-like and really painful, and God was nowhere to be seen. And it wasn't until months later that somebody actually gave me a book that I read, and I was like, oh yeah, that's what that is too. I was like, dark night of the soul. I've heard that before. I just didn't know that's what that was.
Right.
But as often I think with those of us who do follow God, he takes really hard things and he turns them for good. And during that time, I started asking really hard questions. And I discovered that there were things about my faith that I would have told you a couple years ago were not true at all, but there were things that way down deep under all that pain that I found that were really important, that deepened my relationship in a lot of ways. I realized that I thought that if I participated and acted in certain ways that I was supposed to, then I was going to get certain things from God. And then that turns out that I'm operating in a very transactional way, which is not really faith.
Yeah.
And that was a hard pill for me to swallow.
And yours was
realize.
less obvious. It wasn't like you were like, if you give me this role, I'll go to church on Sunday.
Right, yeah.
And so yours were more subtle, and so you had to find them there. Yeah.
And I hear friends talk about this too, who are, looking for love relationships. They're like, I did all the right things. Why am I? I'm like, that's transactional. It's not, like, that's not, we're not promised that.
Yeah.
And that was hard. Actually, I was kind of mad about that right at first. I was like, hey, wait a minute. But it takes you to a deeper level. Like, do you really trust him? Is that why you're in it? And the other thing that I think was really hard at the time, and is now I find really beautiful, is I kept hearing the verse, God, I'm going to mess it up, I'm not a biblical scholar.
That's okay.
God moves all things for good. And I was like, no, he doesn't. Because none of this in my life is very good right now. And so I found that verse, and I was like, oh no, it's, for me anyway, I'm not telling anybody how to interpret the Bible, but for me anyway, it became more like, he is working all things for good. But it's not necessarily my good in my definition of it. It's not necessarily my good, and I might not see it in this lifetime. Like, maybe it's bigger than that. And because he's God, I don't get to get it. I don't get to understand it all. I just have to choose to trust him or not. And then that's my choice. And I'm going to make this sound very simple, but at the end of the day, I came to a place where I thought, okay, well, do I believe there's a God? Yes, I do. Then I have the choice to trust him or not. I guess I'm going to trust him.
Wow.
Because what am I going to do? If there's a God, am I going to not trust him?
Yeah.
And that means I'm going to trust him regardless of what happens.
Wow. Oh, that's a difficult place to get to, but I think you're so right. I think that's such great wisdom. We're going to take a break and come back. She's just shared such great wisdom. I don't know what you're going through and what kind of separation you may have, God, that's caused by a church or some other situation like that, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in this woman, and we want to hear more from her right after this break. Welcome back. Carly's been telling us her story of having been hurt by a church she loved, and her finding her way through the dark night of the soul and back to a place where she could have faith and trust in God. So you come to that realization that you're going to still trust him. What do you do to heal yourself?
Well, I decided to do the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, which is an old Benedictine monk tradition, and so it ended up taking me about a year. It's a little time intensive. At first I thought, why would anybody want to do this? But it was remarkable. And I don't want to talk about too much of the details because I think it would be different for everybody, but God showed up amazingly, and I reconnected with how much he loves me, how much he loves all of us in a way that I never had before, and really pushed through further on the idea of trusting him. And I have a much deeper faith now than I ever did before. And so it's been a remarkable journey. I'm so grateful in so many ways. I think back to the really hardness of that, and I've gotten so much beauty out of it. The strange thing is that I'm still not in a church, even though my faith is so much deeper. And I think it's a little weird that I've sort of become the statistic. But I hope that there's more to the story, I guess.
And there is. And I think that there are those of you who are struggling with a situation right now. And I think what we can learn from Carla is, first of all, to handle with as much maturity as possible, to realize what's our problem with other people who've hurt us or angered us, what's our problem with God, who's hurt us or angered us, and to separate those two issues and then find ways to do it. She communicated with the people in her church. That helped to get at least a little bit of closure and understanding there. And then she dealt with God and what was going on with that. Also returning to the roots, she went back to some ancient practices. Maybe there's an ancient practice that can help sustain you when a current modern church isn't doing that. Whatever it is that you need, we hope you'll go out and seek it because we believe God will be there to help you find it. Thanks so much for being a part of our show today. We'll see you next time.